So welcome, Gerard, and welcome with the customer experience session. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Happy to be here, and greetings. Excuse me, of course, when I start talking is exactly when I get a frog in my throat. Welcome to my session, Learning to Love Linux and ZVM. This is going to be really more of an experience session that goes through a little bit of how I got onto the platform and some of the things that I found out when I did. And just a relaying of someone who's newer to the platform. I've been working on the platform for about 7 years now, and how my experience differs from my experience in the distributed world. So with that, let's start off with a little bit about my background. So I first started working in the computing industry in around 2002. I'd been piddling and playing around with computers for my whole life at that point. I had a couple of different relatives who'd worked with computers and had introduced them to me as a child. But in 2002 is when I first got my job at a University College Worcester back in England, which later became the University of Worcester. And it was a basic help desk type job. While I was there, we went from being a standalone IT department to being integrated into what they called Information and Learning Services, which was a merger of the library, the IT department, and the print and media departments. So I ended up being kind of an IT/AV technician, and that's part of what I was describing here on this part of the chart. It was back in 2002. We were still in kind of like the early stages of everybody doing presentations using computers, and so all the rooms at the college that would have lectures in them didn't have projectors. So we had these carts that had a projector and a laptop, but lecturers would always request them as a PowerPoint, and I was often tempted to just give them like a CD of of Microsoft Office as a bit of a joke when they requested that. But this was actually where I got my introduction into Linux. I ended up working several evening shifts 3 times a week pretty much, and after about 6 o'clock in the evening it started getting pretty quiet, and I felt that my direction in working in IT, I was getting kind of further and further away from what I considered the real nuts and bolts of computing. And so I'd seen things online about this Linux thing and decided to give it a go, and essentially went through, if you're familiar with the website distrowatch.com, essentially went through and picked distros that seemed kind of interesting to me and installed them and tried to figure out what was going on with this Linux thing. And for those who may not have used Linux before or not extensively, if you want a really instructive process to do, then go and grab Gentoo Linux. It's spelled like the penguin, Gentoo. It's got an amazing install manual, and you have to compile your own kernel and write your own configuration files, and it's 2 days of not talking to the outside world, but it's really interesting stuff. So I got my introduction to Linux there, and then I stayed with the university for a couple of years, and then moved on to work in some systems administration roles. The first role that I had was at a company called Dana Corporation. They're a worldwide global drivetrain manufacturer, and I did a lot of AIX administration there. They had an Informix database based business system, and I drove a lot because I covered three different sites there. There's in Birmingham in England, which is where I was based, and then there was one about 70 miles away, and then another one in Volkermart in Austria. Unfortunately, never got to go to that site. I would have loved to, but it was here that I really kind of started getting into the systems administration side of things and touching some Unix stuff. And then after about a little while there, I moved on to a company called OGL. And OGL's business model is they're a software manufacturer, software author, and their software is a inventory management system. And their model is they'll sell the customer a server, and then that server resides at the customer site. So my job was to administer any non-OGL software operating systems and supporting products on that box. And I got to excuse me, I got to experience a fair amount of interesting situations there. Did lots of bash scripting, and then got to deal with SCO Unix as well, which is not something you see in the wild very much these days. And I'm kind of glad of that, because I recall one time when I was doing a time change for daylight savings, I didn't have any built-in mechanism to do that automatically because it was such an old version, and all of a sudden my session, which was a telnet session connected over a modem, got disconnected. Turned out, according to the customer, that there was actually a kernel panic when I just changed the time by an hour. So not the most stable of systems. In 2007, I took a bit of a left turn with my career and started working in digital forensics. I'm really kind of grateful for this part of my career, because what it really gave me the opportunity to do was, first of all, develop the analytical side of my repertoire of skills, but also really delve into the deep nuts and bolts and the actual structures of computing. I learned a lot about file systems and how they were laid out. Lots of looking at hex and figuring out things like file signatures and file structures. Did some reverse engineering of various different things, including at the time Google Earth, when it was still a desktop application, had a file in it that would keep track of all of the viewed locations. And there was a piece of research that was published on that, and I wrote some Python that did some extraction of those locations for a particular case. Not a career that I would necessarily recommend staying in for a long time. It kind of erodes your faith in humanity a little bit, because you're seeing kind of the seedier side of the world, which I think any law enforcement or law enforcement adjacent career path really does. But it was definitely a very interesting part of my career. Ended up moving to the US, and in 2013, I interviewed for a job at America First Credit Union. I was actually interviewing for 2 jobs that week, and I'll get onto that in a couple of slides. But I found out that I was going to be, if I got the job, I was going to be working administering Linux systems on the mainframe, on the Z platform, and when I got onto the job, when I ultimately got the job where I still am today, it was like a revelation to me. It was like, okay, I finally found where I should be, and all these distributed systems that I've been on before, they were kind of dead to me. So, America First Credit Union. It was founded in 1939 as Fort Douglas Civilian Employees Credit Union. This picture actually is a picture of the original members of the credit union right after it was formed. And you can kind of see in the background there, they're standing on a structure there. That's actually a pagoda that's since been demolished down in Salt Lake City, but we actually have a replica of that at our at our operations campus. So if you're ever visiting Utah, you can swing by and take a look at that. It's kind of cool to have that. We are a not-for-profit member-owned organization. We have members. We don't have customers. I remember one time when I was at IBM, I think it was Think. No, it wasn't Think. It was Enterprise 2014. And the CEO of IBM at the time was interviewing someone from another credit union on stage, and we were like 25 rows back or something like that in this giant auditorium. And every time he would talk about, tell us about your customer experience, your customer's experience, my boss who was sitting next to me would yell, members, because the customer word in the credit union world is a little bit taboo. We just hit 1 million members last year, which is pretty big for us. It makes us the 6th largest credit union by membership. And also last year we hit $10 billion in assets, although right now we're right around $12 billion. And that makes us the 9th largest credit union by assets. I know some of my colleagues in the banking industry are probably looking at this and going, that's small fry, but in the credit union, it's fairly large. We have 131 branches across Utah, Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, Arizona, and New Mexico. Oregon, Idaho, Arizona, and New Mexico, kind of newer markets for us. With credit unions, you can't just kind of set up and build wherever you like. The NCUA, the National Credit Union Association, regulates where you can operate your business. So we changed the way that we establish our charter, which defines our field of membership a few years ago, and that's allowed us to expand into these markets. When I started at the credit union, we were just in Utah and Nevada, but we still kind of primarily a Utah-based organization, but we have operations in all of these markets now. So we are definitely an expanding credit union. A little bit of the history about Linux on ZVM at AFCU. Our first production system went in 2004, and it was our ATM system. And that system is actually still in production. We're currently in the process of evaluating and migrating that system to a newer software package. But hopefully going to stay, at least a large component of it is going to stay on Linux on Z. We're a SUSE shop. We run SUSE Linux Enterprise Server, mainly version 12 these days. Our primary workload that the vast majority of our IFL capacity goes to MQ broker, and actually IIB version 10 is what we're running right now, and we're looking to merge toward App Connect Enterprise in the future. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we are a growing environment. We have more Linux guests now than we ever have. Our Linux workload has increased and is more diverse than it's ever been. Historically, it was primarily that MQ broker IIB load, but we also have our DevOps environment for our core banking application is all hosted on Linux on Z now. And yeah, Linux on Z is a massive part of our organization, and lots of investment in both. In fact, one of the testaments to that is when I started my job in 2013, I was the sole administrator of Linux on Z, and then became and kind of tag teamed ZVM later on with a contractor, Sam Cohen. I think he's watching. But right now, our Unix Linux team that takes care of both our Linux on Z and AIX administration needs is a 3-person team. So we've definitely grown in that regard. We operate with 2 SSI clusters, a production and test. Each of those has 4 members, 2 of which are defined for active at the active data center, and 2 of which are defined for disaster recovery. We're currently running VM 6.7.1 and SLES 12 for the vast majority, although we're moving toward SLES 15 in the near future. One of the things that we run is SUSE Manager. It's been a big benefit for configuration management and also patch application. The Unix and Linux administration team make heavy use of that product and are really happy with it. From a VM perspective, we're a domain shop, and other products that we run are Operations Manager, which I put in a little over a year ago now, and it's been a great benefit to us. It's a really great product. And then also we implemented RACF during, and this is a little sneak peek for my session tomorrow. We did a VSE to ZOS migration within the last few years, and RACF was implemented at that point, as was Performance Toolkit and the Omegamon suite. So we've kind of got that single pane of glass for systems monitoring, management, and capacity planning. So just a little bit about how I came to work on the platform. It was I'd moved to the US and got my work permit and started working with a recruitment agency to get into work. And I had 2 interviews in the same week. The first one was not with AFCU, it was with another company down in Salt Lake City. And I thought that interview went really well, and it was great. And I was kind of thinking, well, this is probably the job I'm going to take. And then I went to the credit union and started talking to them about their requirements. But on the morning of my interview, I'm the kind of guy who's like 2 hours early for a plane. I hate being late, and I hate the prospect of being late. So I didn't really know where I was going. So I decided to drive there early and sat in the car, panicking and worrying about my interview and what I was going to do and what I was going to say. But I was sitting outside this building, which is actually building 3 here at the credit union, at the operation campus, where I'm not right now. But this is actually the management center, and I was sitting in the lobby, and I'd spoken to the receptionist, and then I got a call from my recruitment agency saying they're wondering where you are. I'm like, I'm sitting in the lobby of building 3. I've been here for like 15 minutes. And it turned out my recruitment agent had told me that I was supposed to go to building 3 when I was actually supposed to go to building 1. And immediately I thought, well, I'm not going to get this job, am I? But luckily I did. The interview was really interesting. And one thing that it really uncovered to me was that there's this whole universe of computing out there that is largely unknown. And maybe it's personal ignorance. I might be projecting on the rest of everyone. But in at least in the industries that I've worked in, the Z environment really was much less well known and less understood than you may think. I remember after the interview, I went home and started frantically researching it, because I think I'd heard of it before, maybe back in the S390 days, but I didn't really know much about it. And because I couldn't get my hands on it, I was like, okay, I'm going to move on to other things, like the Spark architecture, for example, and other RISC architectures that kind of seemed interesting. Alternate computing architectures already been kind of had always been kind of interesting to me, but Z was one I'd never been able to touch. So it was largely unknown to me, and I think that we in the Z world kind of tend to forget that. And I remember stumbling across, I think it was Bob Rogers' article about how MVS runs the Western world, and how we'd all be pretty hosed if it went away very suddenly. So it was a kind of a really interesting educational experience, and I was like, okay, whatever happens, I've got to get this job because I really want to work on this stuff. This stuff seems kind of cool. And then my next question really was, what is it? A little pun there for you in the title. And I was told by multiple people when I started my job, they were like, it's just Linux. It's just Linux. Fantastic. And sure, you get your hands on it and it feels like Linux. But there's some really, really cool stuff with Linux on Z. And it looks a little bit different when you log into the console, obviously. And 3270 was something brand new to me that I had to get used to. So I started getting my hands on it, and I had a lot of questions. I was really kind of confused by some of the things I was hearing. So the first thing that I heard was well, this is a virtualized environment. I was like, cool, I've worked with VMware and touched KVM a little bit. And I was like, okay, I know Oracle VirtualBox, which some of you may be familiar with. But first question I had was, what do you mean virtualization has been around since 1967? This was something that was new to me in like 2003, maybe. And I was absolutely amazed to find out that this subdivision of computing had been going back since long before I was born, and I thought that was kind of a cool environment to be working in. The next thing I was absolutely shocked about was just how many virtual machines you can run in a single instance. We, as I mentioned, we have a 4-member SSI cluster with 2 active members, but we process millions and millions of transactions every day with a little over 100 virtual machines, and we're only running 4 different LPARs for that. So it's pretty amazing stuff. I was kind of amazed that I heard the 99.59 uptime statistic fairly early on, and I was like, there's no way it's this reliable. But then I started learning a bit more about the architecture and realized that it's designed that way, and it's pretty cool. But with a new environment comes confusion. And I started hearing all these acronyms, LPARs, DASD, OSAs, CKD. So I've got CP there twice. That's not a mistake, because, of course, there's the control program under VM. But then also general purpose engines get called CPs as well. So I was really confused. What's an IFL? CMS, isn't that a content management system? I was really, really confused by a lot of these things. And IBM really has its own language. And I think a lot of people who've worked in the industry, in particular on the mainframe for a long time, don't appreciate that a lot of these acronyms are kind of confusing and aren't used commonly. So a coworker of mine will often say to like our distributed administration colleagues, yeah, well, we just, we've got to get a little bit of extra DASD for that. And I see their eyes gloss over, and they don't really know what he's talking about. But it's kind of an interesting world to get into. I was amazed that we were running essentially on a single core, but because of the constraints of the Intel architecture, they do all sorts of unnatural things, such as multiple tons and tons of cores to overcome the inherent deficiencies of the architecture. But because the IBM Z architecture was designed from the ground up for this business type processing and server applications, I know we have multiple cores now on IFLs, but still on CPs, we're still a single core. So it's kind of amazing to me to find that coming from an environment where it's like 32 cores is the minimum you need to run a mail server, and coming in and running an entire enterprise on 3 single core processors was just mind blowing. Also, about 6 months, maybe a little less after I started, we did a disaster recovery test, and I'll get onto this a little bit later on. Probably nothing unique, but I was amazed at how simple and easy it was. It was pretty impressive stuff. And then I had the question, why doesn't everyone know about this? It seems like this is such a major part. We hear the statistics about the massively large percentages, and we heard from some of the presentations earlier on this morning as to how even things like VSE but also ZOS and Linux on Z touch every part of your life. Every time you use a debit card or credit card, you're likely to be using a Z system, and interacting with insurance agencies, airlines, governments, all that sort of stuff. You're going to be touching a Z system. So why isn't it more well known? And I'm still kind of trying to find out the answer to that question. So I've been on the platform for a little bit of time, and I was starting to get familiar with it, and I started to see some of the differences. But I was feeling more and more comfortable because I was in an environment that was familiar. I still had Bash, I still had grep and awk and sed and all of my favorite toys that I like to play with under Linux. But then I started to really recognize the power of the platform because of this symbiotic relationship that VM and Linux have. And as I was working primarily on Linux systems, my curiosity about ZVM was really kind of increasing, and I wanted to get my hands on it. And luckily, my management were very keen to allow me to play with that carefully, so I didn't break anything. I was terrified of breaking anything anyway. So, and I had a great mentor in Sam Cohen from LRS who really kind of helped me learn a lot about ZVM. Was very good at explaining the things to me that I really didn't understand. And a lot of it's just syntax, right? Like I said with the previous chart, there are acronyms and terms that mean the same thing, but might be spoken a little bit differently in the Z language. But I started recognizing this cool close relationship that VM and Linux really have, and it seemed different to previous hypervisors that I dealt with other virtualization environments, and my knowledge on that's a little bit older now because I've been working on VM for the better part of a decade. But it always seemed like the hypervisor got in your way, whereas I feel like VM does its very best to get out of your way, and that's definitely a great strength of the platform. And another strength of the platform was efficiency. I felt like I said, other hypervisors were kind of getting in your way and weighing you down, weighing your guest operating system down. Whereas things like, whereas with VM, it was much more lightweight and kind of tried to get out of your way. I recall running a mail server under VMware Server, which was the free edition of VMware. So please don't try and compare it to any of the new ESXi stuff that's out there that's kind of more enterprise ready. This was kind of a more rudimentary implementation, but still, we had a very. I worked at a school for a while. We had a very small mail server that probably only dealt with 1,000 to 1,500 messages per day. But still, even to boot and run efficiently, we needed 2.5 gig of memory, and this was in probably about 2006. And then I got onto ZVM and found out that our entire ATM's application was running in 768 meg of memory in 2013, and ran that way for several years following that. In fact, the only thing that made us increase the memory of that guest to over a gig was that the Spectrum Protect TSM client came out with a new version, and it wouldn't start in such a small virtual machine. But what really makes the difference? And so I remember it was either a share session or a webinar of some kind of conference session, and I remember hearing Alan Altmark use the phrase. And I might be if Alan's listening, or if anyone is going to relay this to Alan, I might be butchering his what he said here, but he said something to the effect of, when you start a virtual machine, it's essentially an instantiation of the architecture. So you're essentially presenting an instantiation of the Z architecture, the principles of operation, rather than emulation. Other hypervisors, and this isn't as true as it was back when I had my hands heavily on VMware and those sorts of products, where practically everything was emulated hardware. But we do instantiation on ZVM, and we don't do as much, or if any, emulation, and that speeds things up incredibly. And that was kind of an aha moment for me. And another moment, Bill Bittner, I remember first hearing him use the term SIE, SIE, for start interpretive execution, and I remember hearing it and being like, what is that? And after whatever presentation I was watching was over, I went frantically Googled it and started to learn a little bit about that and exactly why that was such an important thing. And it's one of those things that kind of makes the puzzle pieces come together and realize, okay, this is really what differentiates ZVM, and this is why it's so cool. And this is why we can run such great workloads on it. So here's a little example. I mentioned earlier on about our disaster recovery. This is just kind of this is a rough diagram of our production layouts. We've got our primary data center on the left-hand side and our disaster recovery site on the left. But one of the advantages I saw of VM was, okay, I need to apply maintenance to the hypervisor. That means I need to take an outage, right? Well, not when you're in an SSI cluster, because you've got this awesome, cool thing called live guest relocation, where you can non-disruptively move that workload to a different LPAR in the same SSI cluster and keep going. And whatever you need to do in the partition that you've located it from, and keep things going. But you might notice that CMS mini disk box on the screen there. What that represents is, and I believe this was actually implemented by my predecessor. But one of the really cool things is and it kind of goes to this tight relationship between VM and Linux, is that you're able to talk to the hypervisor and store things there that relate to the guest. So we have in place a boot script that runs on boot that looks for this CMS mini disk and finds a parameters file that has all sorts of identifying information in the file that tells the guest exactly what its identity is, depending on where it's coming up. So at our primary data center, for example, we have all of our Linux guests have two network interfaces configured: an Ethernet interface for external communication, and then a HyperSockets interface for internal communication. Now, when we move to the disaster recovery site, that HyperSockets interface doesn't change. The IP it's a private network that's only dealt with within the Z environment, talking between Linuxes and ZOS virtual machines and VM. But the public interface, the Ethernet interface, because we're at a different data center, we're plugged into different switch gear. The VLAN changes, and then so the actual one of the octets in the IP address changes on us. And unlike experiences I'd had in the past, where I had to do a lot of manual reconfiguration when we came up in a disaster recovery environment, this system, and I think it was a presentation by Rick Barlow. I think it was a system, a process that he came up with, although I might be wrong about that, but that's kind of my understanding of the history, where we read this configuration file and execute this boot script to understand where we're coming up and set those kinds of things correctly. And formerly, when we used a lot of fixed block storage, it would do the same for the WWPNs for the fixed block storage addressing. So when we use a global mirror disk subsystem, global mirror, to replicate all of our disks to our backup data center. But when we come up at this alternate site, there's very little that needs to be done. And that's one of the things that we found out since we migrated to ZOS, actually, is that there's a lot more manual reconfiguration that needed to be done with certain products. We've got a good amount of that parameterized now, so that we have a variable that identifies the site that we're coming up on based upon the machine that we're coming up on. But this was kind of a real aha moment for me. Again, I was kind of amazed by how simple this was and how seamlessly we could come up. We weren't the bottleneck for once. I felt like when I was working at other companies where we did disaster recovery, particularly Dana, when I worked there, we did a failover to an alternate site. And it felt like, well, the business is waiting on us to get up because we're doing a lot of reconfiguration and we're trying to figure out a lot of stuff. And part of the smoothness is owed to the fact that we have a very good relationship with a disaster recovery consultant who put together a really, really great book for us to do that. But without the flexibility of this environment, we still see that with some of our dependent guests or dependent systems, such as AIX systems, for example. There's some manual reconfiguration that's required there because this kind of smoothness, that this tight integration with a fully fledged operating system like ZVM that has greater capabilities than simply being a hypervisor. It's excellent at being a hypervisor, but it has many other functions as well, and is a very mature product. Really, really was an amazing revelation for me. And speaking of ZVM, I started to really get my feet wet with VM after a few months, and my role transitioned from being a Linux on Z, although my official, I know we don't like to use the word Z Linux. I know it's kind of against the style guide, but I was Linux on Z administrator, and then I moved into being a systems programmer and started working on VM much more heavily, and really kind of getting my hands dirty with that, and was excited with to be able to get used to that stuff. And one of the things that really stood out to me was the power that Rex gives you. Rex is a language that's really not well known outside of the mainframe world. I know it was heavily used on IBM's OS/2 operating system, but and I'm glad that there are interpreters like Regina for Linux outside, but it's not a heavily used environment, and I think probably heavily used outside of the environment, I should say. I do see it a good amount on ZOS, but the one thing that ZOS is really missing, and I started finding this when I started touching ZOS, was this real eureka moment for me, which was, you can probably tell what I'm representing here. It was CMS pipelines. Pipelines is like a combination of sed, org, grep, and so much more, all in one extremely powerful product. It's a truly amazing tool, and you really miss it when you don't have it. So when I first moved on to ZOS and started writing Rex and thinking, well, how would I do this in VM? Oh, I'd use pipelines, and maybe there's a version of an old version of pipes for Rex on ZOS, but it's certainly not as tightly integrated as it is onto ZVM, and it doesn't provide the super powerful interface. You know, we saw yesterday some information on SSL, and there was some great. And this is another thing that I love about the VM and Linux community is the second that it was the SSL support for, I think it was in Bill's presentation for pipelines. There was talk about a sponsor user opportunity there, and I've done some sponsor user stuff, by the way. Please participate. It's great. The amazing thing about it was people were coming up with ideas straight away as to how they could use that SSL to either submit dumps to IBM or potentially retrieve service, and very, very cool stuff. And that, but Rex, once it was confusing at first, but once I started learning it, it was great. And there's tons of great resources out there. And one of them is this mark.net website. If you go to the tutorials there, there's a Rex course, several Rex courses, in fact, that take you from the basics of a Hello World program all the way through to some really advanced stuff. And I've gone through some of those, and I would highly recommend those if you're really looking to get into Rex. So that's pretty much all I have. I think I'm a little bit early, but if there are any questions, if you have anything you'd like to ask, I know this is kind of a lighter on the technical content, but my experience with Linux on VM has been fantastic, and there's kind of no other platform I'd really like to work on anymore other than Z, and being able to kind of have the ability to work on these systems and learn them has been amazing to me. And one of the things that I think IBM is now starting to do a better job of, and I think it's been kind of a shame that this hasn't been going on in the past, is the things like the academic initiative. And I did Master the Mainframe back in 2014. So if you're newer to the mainframe, then I would highly recommend doing Master the Mainframe. But there's developing younger talent. I know that there's some amazing experienced professionals, and their contributions to the community are extremely valued. And I wouldn't have anywhere near the knowledge I have if I hadn't had several mentors, but particularly in Sam, to help me learn this platform and kind of really learn to love it. But yeah, with that, I'm going to stop talking now unless there are some questions.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Any questions? And you can unmute yourself to ask questions through the mic or use the chat now.
So I see there's one question in the chat about managing FCP and SCSI disconnection when doing live guest relocation. Good question, actually. We haven't. So the WWPNs would stay the same when we did live guest relocation between members of the cluster because that was how we had it configured. We don't do FCP anymore, or SCSI. So I imagine that would stay the same as it is now. But we did have multiple for when we moved sites. There were different variables within the parameters file that we had different WWPNs for the various SCSI controllers, or actually we used a SAN virtual controller environment that we would connect to, so it would know where we were coming up.
There's another question, Gerard, that is asking, do you know the decision, or how the decision was made to use Linux on Z?
That's a really good question, actually. Well, we'd been a Z environment for a long time, and we'd had ZVM for a long time. I actually don't. It was before my time at the credit union when the decision to make Linux on Z was made. But I know that we've always had, as a VSE customer for nearly 40 years, we had a very tight relationship with the wonderful folks, including Ingolf, who was on one of his previous presentations. With the Berblingen lab and the IBM team who are developing the Linux on Z capabilities. So I think it was probably just mentioned in one of the customer consultation sessions with IBM, and we were probably looking to, I believe, and maybe Sam even knows this, we were looking to extend our Z capacity, and it seemed like the right thing to do. But yeah, I don't know the exact history of that, but it's been very successful for us, that's for sure.
Gerard, this is Sam. Actually, the background on that was that because you needed, as you mentioned, it was the ATM application, the data resided on VSE, so they wanted the application, the middleware, being the ATM application, to be running close to VSE.
Makes sense.
And to be able to easily work at DR, so they didn't have to replicate the entire infrastructure at the DR site.
Well, I can also say, you know, I worked from the first day on when Linux was introduced at AFCU, and I did a lot of work in terms of also on site. So basically, we had workshops on site, and it was, as Sam mentioned, but also the strategy of VSE was to enhance the VSE functionality and capability with a Linux on Z collocated with ZVSE, and that's where American First Credit Union was using or was introducing it, you know, with the capabilities to enhance the ZVSE capability in terms of integration, in terms of communication, in terms of modernization. So therefore, yeah, it was a step forward with the VSE environment.
Absolutely, yeah, and that tight integration with the VSE environment continued onward. As I mentioned, you know, our primary environment, our primary workload on Linux on Z was and continues to be the IIB MQ message broker middleware, yeah. and that's that the ability to speak to VSE and now ZOS over hypersockets and have that really fast internal communication was just invaluable to us, and has really continued to pay off for that investment that we put into the environment. It's a really smooth and highly performant environment to work in. See another question about Rex tutorials. I would recommend looking at some Share presentations. I went to a couple of labs at Share in, I think, 2014. I think it was when I was in Anaheim, and there were some really great. I think it was either Richard Lewis or Bruce Hayden who ran those labs. Maybe someone else, but it was those labs had some really good. I referred to those slides when I was first learning Rex, so I would definitely look at those. And then if you Google and pretty much any Rex syntax, you'll come to a website that's called something like Kilowatt, and it's got really great Rex language reference stuff. So if you want to know the syntax of, say, I don't know, the if statements in Rex. You can Google if statements Rex, and it takes you to this kilowatt website, and they have some really great syntax diagrams that help me at least understand some of that Rex syntax really well, slightly better than the manuals, I'd say.
I can also add, you can look for NetRex, and Rex was available even on OS2 at that time, and I'm not sure if it's not a package available for Windows as well today. I think it was, but I'm not sure because I'm not using it right now. But Rex was, started at that time to be available on the different operating systems and platforms.
Excellent. It's a great language, but that nothing has pipes. Pipes is great. Although I did see someone mention something about batch pipes on COS. I'm gonna have to look into that. Tracy Dean, thank you so much for that. I'm going to take a look at that for sure.
Well, somebody asked if you know about NG pipes.
I'm not familiar with that. No.
So that could be an adjacent technology that could be looked at.
Very useful.
Okay, wonderful. Any other questions? Thank you very much. It was very nice and very grateful that we could hear, about the story and your way that brought you from Gentoo Linux to Linux on Z.
Yes. Yeah, it's been an exciting thing, and thanks everyone for attending it. It was a pleasure to speak to you today, and yeah, hopefully you enjoy the rest of the day. VM Workshop is a really great conference, and I'm glad we were able to have it this year virtually. It was a disappointment definitely when the current situation caused us to have to move online, but again, thanks everyone for attending, and thanks for all the positivity. I'm seeing it in the chat, so most appreciated, and have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you those of you who are attending tomorrow for my experience with our VSE to ZOS conversion.